Welcome to Stories for Sleep. If you're looking for calming, mysterious stories to guide you into a peaceful sleep, you're in the right place. Don't forget to subscribe for more enchanting tales, like this video if it helps you drift off, and turn on notifications to never miss a story. We'd love to know, what time is it and where are you watching from? Drop a comment and let us know. Sweet dreams and happy listening.
The small town of Willow Creek was known for its quiet, unassuming charm. Nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and fog-covered hills. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, at the edge of town, hidden from plain sight, stood an old, decrepit mansion. Overgrown vines crawled up the sides of the faded stone walls, and shattered windows cast eerie reflections in the dim light. No one dared to venture near, for the locals believed the mansion was cursed, a remnant of a forgotten past that still held onto its secrets. When Samuel, his wife Eleanor, and their two children, Oliver and young Grace, moved into Willow Creek, they were drawn to the mansion's Gothic allure. Samuel, a restoration enthusiast, saw it as the perfect project, convinced that with some hard work, he could restore its former glory. Eleanor, however, felt an unsettling chill the moment they stepped inside. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "Come on, Ellie, just look at this place," Samuel had said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "It's beautiful in its own way." Eleanor forced a smile, but the feeling of being watched never left her. As they settled into their new home, she couldn't shake the sense that they weren't alone. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision. Whispers drifted down the hallways, and sometimes in the dead of night she thought she heard faint footsteps echoing through the old wooden floors. The children, however, were captivated by the mansion's mystery. Oliver, the older sibling, was fascinated by the hidden passageways and dusty old rooms filled with antique furniture. Grace, though only 6, would often stare at things that weren't there, her innocent eyes fixed on the empty corners of the rooms. It was on their first night in the mansion that the strangeness began. As the family gathered in the dimly lit living room, the lights flickered, and an icy breeze seemed to sweep through the room, though all the windows were closed. Eleanor clutched Grace closer, her heart pounding, while Samuel laughed nervously, brushing it off as an electrical issue. But later that night, as Eleanor lay in bed beside Samuel, she was startled awake by a faint, childlike whisper coming from the hallway. Her first thought was that it must be Grace or Oliver out of bed. She slipped out of the room, the wooden floorboards creaking beneath her feet, and walked into the darkened hallway. "Grace? Oliver?" she whispered, but there was no response. As she approached the end of the hall, she felt a sudden chill that made her stop in her tracks. The air was colder than she'd ever felt, almost as if it were drawing the warmth out of her. Eleanor's out of her shivered, wrapping her arms around herself, and in that moment, she heard it again, a soft, faint voice calling her name. "Eleanor." Her heart raced as she spun around, her eyes wide, but there was no one there. She returned to her room, trying to convince herself it was her imagination, the product of nerves and exhaustion. Yet, as she lay back down, the unease lingered, like a shadow that clung to her soul. The following days were no better. Each night, the whispers grew louder, and Eleanor began to notice strange things around the house. Objects moved from one place to another. Small handprints appeared on the dust-covered windows, and the faint sound of laughter echoed through the rooms. Oliver told her he had seen a woman in old-fashioned clothes standing at the top of the stairs, staring down at him with a sad, empty expression. Grace would often whisper to herself as if speaking to an unseen friend. Eleanor could feel the mansion tightening its grip on them, as if the walls were closing in, watching their every move. But Samuel dismissed her fears, insisting that the house was simply old and in need of repair. Despite her unease, Eleanor tried to ignore the signs, tried to believe that it was all in her head. But deep down, she knew that the mansion held secrets that were beginning to awaken. As the days turned into weeks, the mansion seemed to tighten its grip on the family. Eleanor's unease grew, but Samuel remained dismissive, engrossed in the restoration process, often working late into the night. The children, though fascinated by the mansion, began to exhibit strange behaviors that Eleanor couldn't ignore. One evening, Eleanor found Grace in the nursery, speaking in a low whisper to an empty corner of the room. At first, Eleanor assumed Grace was playing. But as she approached, she heard her daughter's words. "They said they don't like it when we change things," Grace murmured softly, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Who doesn't like it?" "Sweetheart," Grace turned to her mother with an innocent smile, her blue eyes wide. "The people who live here, Mommy. They don't want us here." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine, and she quickly led Grace out of the nursery, dismissing her daughter's words as mere imagination. But later that night, as she lay in bed, her thoughts kept returning to Grace's warning. Was the house truly haunted? And if so, what did it want? As the clock struck midnight, Eleanor woke to a cold draft sweeping through the room. She glanced over to find Samuel sound asleep, unaware of the chill that seemed to fill the air. She lay still, straining to listen, and soon she heard it, a faint but unmistakable whisper drifting through the darkness. "Leave? You're not welcome." Eleanor bolted upright, her heart pounding. She listened intently, but the voice was gone. She glanced at Samuel, hoping he had heard it too. But he had heard it too. But he had remained oblivious, lost in the depths of sleep. She felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that the mansion itself was warning her, as if it held a malevolent consciousness. The next morning, Eleanor tried to speak with Samuel about what she'd heard, but he dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand. "Eleanor, this house is old. Houses make noises, creak, groan, it's natural," he insisted, his tone reassuring. "Besides, think about all the history here. Imagine that stories this place could tell." She nodded reluctantly, trying to believe him, but the mansion's strange occurrences only grew. The whispers became more frequent, as though the walls themselves were breathing, alive with unseen presences. Each night, Eleanor found herself drawn to the staircase, where she would stand at the top, listening to the faint echoes of laughter, footsteps, and sometimes a child sobbing coming from the lower floors. One night, unable to resist, she ventured down the stairs, clutching a candle as she moved through the darkness. The light flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A small, pale handprint smudged on the dusty glass of a nearby window. The handprint was too small to belong to Oliver, and too high for Grace to have reached. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch it, feeling the chill of the glass seep into her fingers. In that moment, a voice echoed through the hall, soft yet piercing. "Help us!" Eleanor recoiled, the candlelight flickering wildly as a gust of wind blew through the hall. She felt a presence behind her, a heavy, suffocating energy that pressed down on her shoulders. Terrified, she turned and fled back up the stairs, her heart racing as the whispers followed her, growing louder with each step. When she reached the bedroom, She bolted the door and crawled into bed beside Samuel, who slept on, blissfully unaware of the terror that gripped her heart. She lay awake for hours, listening to the silence, wondering what the mansion wanted from her, and why it seemed to be calling out for help. In the days that followed, Eleanor's fear turned to resolve. She knew she needed answers. She began to ask around town, hoping someone could shed light on the mansion's dark past. An elderly librarian named Mrs. Hawthorne finally offered her a piece of the puzzle. "Oh, dear Mrs. Hawthorne said, her voice trembling as she recounted the story. "The house belonged to a family, the Walkers. Many years ago, tragedy struck. Their little girl, Emma, disappeared one night. They searched high and low, but she was never she was found. Her mother, poor woman, went mad with grief. Some say her spirit still lingers there, searching for her lost daughter." Eleanor's heart sank as she listened. The pieces were falling into place, the whispers, the cold presence, the cold presence, child's handprint. It was as if the spirits of the house were reaching out to her, begging her to uncover the truth and free them from their suffering. That night, Eleanor lay in bed, unable to sleep. The story of Emma Walker haunted her thoughts, and she knew what she had to do. She would venture into the hidden corners of the mansion, delve into its secrets, and uncover the mystery that had bound the spirits for so long. But as she closed her eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that the mansion was waiting for her, anticipating her every move, as if it were a living entity, watching, lurking, and plotting her next steps in the darkness. The following evening, Eleanor prepared herself to explore the mansion further. She felt a strange determination growing within her, a resolve to uncover the secrets that had been locked away for so long. She equipped herself with an old flashlight she had found in the basement and tucked a small journal into her pocket, intending to record anything unusual she encountered. As she glanced at herself in the hallway mirror, she barely recognized the fear in her own eyes, but she knew they recognized the fear in her own eyes. Was no turning back now. Samuel was busy in his study, going over some architectural blueprints, too absorbed to notice the quiet tension emanating from his wife. She watched him for a moment, wishing she could explain what she was about to do, but deep down she knew he wouldn't understand. He had always been practical, grounded in reality. He would never believe in ghosts or curses, let alone think she was wandering through the house at night searching for spirits. Eleanor made her at night searching for spirits, way down the grand staircase, each step creaking under her weight, as though the house were aware of her every move. The thick velvet curtains draped over the windows blocked out any trace of moonlight, leaving her shrouded in an unnatural darkness. She took a deep breath, her footsteps echoing in the empty hall as she moved toward the east wing, a section of the mansion she had seldom explored. The east wing was colder than the rest of the house, a bitter chill that seemed to seep into her bones. It was here that she first noticed the strange markings on the walls. Symbols etched into the old wallpaper, faded with time, but still visible under the glow of her flashlight. They looked like arcane symbols, swirls and crosses, intersecting lines that seemed to pulse faintly as she moved her light over them. The air grew heavier with each step, and Eleanor felt a presence looming over her, as though someone or something was watching her from the shadows. Her hand trembled as she ran her fingers over one of the symbols, feeling the rough texture of the wallpaper under her skin. The symbols felt cold, almost damp, and she quickly pulled her hand away, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. Just then, she heard a faint, shuffling sound coming from one of the rooms ahead. She held her breath, her mind racing. It sounded like the dragging of feet, slow and deliberate, moving just beyond the threshold of the doorway. Eleanor took a cautious of the doorway, stepped forward, her flashlight trained on the door. The wood was cracked and faded, a relic from another era. She could see the faint outline of handprints, small and smudged, pressed into the dusty surface of the door, as if someone had been frantically trying to push it open from the other side. Swallowing her fear, Eleanor placed her hand on the door and slowly pushed it open. The room beyond was filled with old, tattered furniture draped in white sheets, giving the eerie impression of ghostly figures huddled together in the darkness. Dust motes danced in the air, swirling in the beam of her flashlight. The walls were lined with shelves filled with ancient books, their spines cracked and faded. As she stepped further into the room, her flashlight flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. Her skin prickled with unease, and she fought the urge to turn and flee. She knew she had to keep going, to face whatever secrets lay hidden in the mansion. In the far corner of the room, she noticed an old painting hanging on the wall. The canvas was darkened with age, but she could make out the faint outline of a family, a mother, a father, and a little girl, all standing before the very same mansion she was now inside. The child in the painting wore a locket around her neck, a small heart-shaped pendant that gleamed faintly even through the dust and grime. Eleanor stepped closer, her eyes drawn to the child's expression. There was something unsettling about her face, a hollow look in her eyes that seemed to follow her, no matter where she stood. It was as if the child were staring directly at her, a silent plea for help frozen in time. Suddenly, Eleanor felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She gasped, spinning around, but there was no one there. Her heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she glanced around the empty room. She was alone, or so she thought. The silence was shattered by a soft, childlike giggle echoing through the room. It was a haunting sound, distant and faint, like a memory lingering on the edge of reality. Eleanor's hands shook as she raised her flashlight, sweeping it across the room, but there was no sign of anyone. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her own heart. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a voice so soft it was almost a whisper, she heard a reply. "Help me." The words sent a chill down her spine, freezing. Freezing her in place. The voice was unmistakably that of a child, a young girl. Her tone laced with desperation and fear. Eleanor's mind raced, her thoughts jumbled. Was it the spirit of Emma Walker, the little girl who had disappeared all those years ago? The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but she knew there was still so much she didn't understand. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she moved toward the corner where the voice had come from. The air grew colder where the voice had come from. The air grew colder with each step, and she felt an overwhelming sense of sadness, as though the very walls of the mansion were weeping in the corner. She found a small wooden box, its surface covered in dust. She knelt down, brushing the dust away with trembling fingers, and lifted the lid. Inside, she found a delicate silver locket, identical to the one in the painting. The locket was cool to the touch, and as she held it in her hand, she felt a wave of emotions wash over her: fear, loss, and an overwhelming sense of longing. As she stood up, clutching the locket, the door to the room slammed shut, plunging her into darkness. Her flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows across the walls, and she felt a presence looming closer, the air growing thick and suffocating. In the darkness, she heard the voice again, closer this time. "Help me find her." Eleanor's grip tightened on the locket, her mind racing. She knew now that the spirits of the house were real, and they danced away down to this very yard. Needed her help, but what lay ahead would test her courage in ways she could never have imagined. As Eleanor stood alone in the darkened room, the weight of the mansion's history pressed down on her like a suffocating blanket. Her fingers trembled around the cold locket, its presence in her hand feeling both comforting and haunting, as if it also was the craze and haunting, as if it held a fragment of the past itself. She took a shuddering breath, her heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. She knew she couldn't ignore the voices any longer. The room felt alive with an invisible energy, an echo of emotions that lingered like a ghostly residue. The walls seemed to breathe, exhaling shadows that twisted and curled along the faded wallpaper. As Eleanor's eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed faint marks scratched into the wall near the floor, tiny, desperate claw marks, as though someone had tried to escape but had been trapped. She ran her fingers over the grooves, feeling the jagged edges under her skin, and an icy shiver ran down her spine. She remembered Mrs. Hawthorne's words about Emma Walker, the girl who had disappeared without a trace. The sorrow and pain that had lingered in the librarian's voice resonated in Eleanor's mind. The mansion wasn't just haunted, it was a prison, a place where Emma's spirit was bound. It was a prison, a place where Emma's spirit was bound, unable to find peace. The silence was heavy, almost oppressive, as she continued to explore the room. Her flashlight had dimmed to a faint glow, casting eerie shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She moved toward the dusty tea. Well, kickers, it's great Genmentures, our frag style. The terrier's bedsteins is a good knife of their own bookshelf, her fingers trailing along the spines of forgotten books. Titles faded with age and neglect lined the shelves, their contents sealed away like the secrets of the mansion. One book, however, caught her eye, a small leather-bound journal with a cracked spine. She pulled it from the shelf, brushing away a layer of dust that clouded the air like smoke. The cover bore the initials, B, and her heart skipped a beat as she realized it must have belonged to Emma Walker herself. Eleanor opened the journal, her eyes scanning the fragile, handwritten pages. Emma's words were faint, scrawled in a child's hand, each letter etched with innocence and hope. As she read, Eleanor felt a strange connection to There's young girl, as though she were reading a message sent through time. Today, Mama let me play in the garden. She says I have to be careful and not wander too far. But I saw someone in the woods. She was wearing a dress like mine, but her face was wine. But her face was sad. I tried to call to her, but she disappeared into the trees. The words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. The description matched the figure that Grace had seen in the house, the woman with the sad eyes and the old-fashioned dress. Mother's spirit, perhaps, lingering in the mansion, searching endlessly for her lost child. Eleanor's pulse quickened as she turned the page, her fingers trembling. The next entry was written in a shaky hand, the letters uneven and rushed. Mama says I must stay inside, but I hear her calling to me. She stands in the garden at night, watching, waiting. I want to go to her, but I'm afraid. Mama says I must never go into the woods at night, but sometimes I feel like she's saying no or me, sister. Shall I go into the woods at night? But sometimes I feel like she's calling me from the other side of the trees. The entry ended abruptly, leaving Eleanor with an overwhelming sense of loss and fear. She could almost hear Emma's voice, a frightened whisper echoing through the years, trapped within whisper echoing through the years, the pages of the journal. As she clutched the journal to her chest, a chill settled over the room, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. The footsteps were slow, and deliberate, each one growing louder as they approached. Eleanor held her breath, her heart racing as she listened to the approaching steps, feeling the air grow colder with each passing second. Suddenly, the door to the room creaked open, revealing a figure standing, her face pale and gaunt, her hollow eyes fixed on Eleanor with a look of unspeakable sorrow. She wore a long, tattered dress, its fabric worn and faded, and her hair hung in loose, tangled waves around her face. The woman's eyes held a depth around her face. The woman's eyes held a depth of sadness that made Eleanor's chest tighten, as though she could feel the weight of years of grief pressing down on her. She took a step forward, her hand reaching out, and Eleanor felt a chill spread through her body, freezing her in place. "Please," the woman whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help her? Find her?" Eleanor's mind reeled as she struggled to make sense of the apparition before her. She knew instinctively that this was Emma's mother, a spirit bound to the mansion by her undying love for her lost child. The woman's gaze held Eleanor captive, and she felt an overwhelming urge to help, to break the chains that bound this spirit to a lifetime of searching. Gathering her courage, Eleanor stepped forward, reaching out to the woman. "I will," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll help you find her. I promise." The woman's face softened, and for a brief moment Eleanor saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes, but as quickly as it appeared, the vision faded, leaving Eleanor alone in the empty room, the chill lingering like a ghostly echo. Determined to fulfill her promise, Eleanor returned to her room that night, the journal clutched tightly in her hands. She knew that the answers lay within the pages of Emma's diary, and she spent hours reading, piecing together the fragments of the young girl's life, trying to understand the events that had led to her disappearance. The night was long and filled with whispers, shadows, shadows dancing on the walls, and the feeling of unseen eyes watching her every move. But Eleanor pushed her fears aside, driven by a sense of duty to help the spirits find peace by morning. She had uncovered a dark truth hidden within the pages of Emma's diary, a secret that had bound the souls of the mansion in eternal unrest. She knew now that the journey to freeing the spirits would not be easy, and that the mansion held even more secrets waiting to be unearthed. As the first light of the Mictincabial dawn broke through the windows, Eleanor prepared herself for what lay ahead, knowing that she was now entwined with the fate of the mansion and the restless spirits that called it home. As the morning sun crept through the cracks in the mansion's old windows, Eleanor felt a newfound resolve settle within her. The weight of Emma's diary was heavy in her hands, and with every page she turned, she was transported deeper into the tragic story of a little girl lost in the shadows of the past. She knew that this diary held only a glimpse of what had happened, fragments of a mystery that demanded to be solved. Eleanor made her way downstairs, drawn by an instinct she stood. "I'll try and roared," couldn't fully explain. The mansion was silent, bathed in the soft glow of morning light, but the shadows clung to the walls as if they were hiding something, waiting for her to uncover it. She moved through the house slowly, her fingers brushing against the faded wallpaper, feeling the pulse of the mansion beneath her fingertips, as though it were a living, breathing entity. As she wandered, she found herself in the old dining room, a grand space with a long, polished table covered in dust. The chairs were arranged around it, frozen in time, as if the ghosts of the past were still seated there, waiting for a meal that would never come. She could almost picture Emma's family gathered around the table, laughter and voices filling the room. But now, only silence remained, and the air was thick with sorrow. Eleanor's gaze fell upon the massive fireplace at the far end of the room. Above it, a large, ornate mirror hung on the wall, its surface clouded with whiz when the Wolverine there hung on the wall. Its surface clouded with age. She approached it slowly, her own reflection barely visible in the tarnished glass. But as she looked closer, she thought she saw movement, shadows shifting behind her, fleeting glimpses of figures that disappeared the moment she turned around. Her heart raced, but she couldn't tear herself away from the mirror. She leaned in, her breath fogging the glass as she tried to peer beyond the surface. Just then, a faint voice whispered, soft and almost imperceptible, "Remember us?" Eleanor gasped, stepping back from the mirror. The voice was a faint echo, like a memory trapped within the glass. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold surface, and felt a sudden surge of emotions, grief, anger, fear, all crashing over her like a wave. She stumbled back, clutching Emma's diary to her chest, as the weight of the mansion's tragic history pressed down on her. Determined to find answers, Eleanor continued to explore the house, each room revealing new clues that hinted at the dark events that had unfolded within these walls. In the library, she found books with strange markings, scribbled in the margins, cryptic symbols and phrases that seemed to hold a hidden meaning. She spent hours poring over them, trying to decipher their secrets, but the meaning eluded her, leaving her with more questions than answers. It was in the mansion's cellar that she made her most chilling discovery yet. The cellar was cold and damp, filled with the musty smell of decay. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and the walls were lined with shelves of dusty, forgotten bottles. She held her flashlight high, its beam cutting through the darkness, revealing a narrow passageway at the far end of the room. The passage was hidden behind a stack of old crates, its entrance barely visible. Eleanor hesitated, her heart pounding, but something compelled her to move forward. She squeezed through the narrow gap, her breath shallow as she descended deeper into the mansion's forgotten depths. The air grew colder as she moved through the passage, the silence oppressive. The walls were rough, carved from stone, and the floor was uneven, forcing her to step carefully. She could step carefully, feel the weight of the earth pressing down on her, and the darkness seemed to close in, swallowing her whole. At the end of the passage, she found a small, hidden room. The walls were covered in strange symbols, similar to those she had seen in the library, but here they were etched deeply into the stone, as though someone had carved them with a desperate hand. In the center of the room, she saw a small, makeshift altar, draped in a tattered cloth. A single candle, long since sorted as for use, extinguished, sat upon it, surrounded by small trinkets, lockets, rings, and other personal items that looked worn and old. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the significance of the room. It was a place of mourning. A hidden shrine to those who had been lost. She knelt down, her fingers brushing over the trinkets, and felt a deep sadness wash over her, as though the very walls were weeping. As she sat in the darkness, the shadows seemed to shift, coalescing into vague, ghostly forms. She could see them figures standing around her, their faces obscured, their eyes filled with sorrow. They were the lost souls of the mansion, bound to this place by tragedy and despair. One figure stepped forward, a young woman with hollow eyes and a haunted expression. She reached out, her hand passing through Eleanor's shoulder, sending a chill through her body. The woman's lips moved, but no sound escaped. Yet Eleanor understood her plea, a silent, desperate cry for release. "I'll help you," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll find a way to free you." The figures faded, leaving Eleanor alone in the cold, dark room. She rose to her feet, her resolve hardening. She knew now that the mansion's spirits were not malevolent. They were trapped, bound to the house by an unbreakable chain of grief and loss. And she was determined to break that chain, to bring peace to the souls that lingered in the shadows. Returning to the main part of the house, Eleanor spent the following days researching, uncovering every detail she could about the Walker family. She learned that Emma's mother had been deeply involved in mysticism, seeking ways to communicate with her lost daughter. The symbols she had found throughout the house were part of an ancient ritual, one that was meant to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. But something had gone wrong. Instead of reuniting mother and child, the ritual had bound their spirits to the mansion, trapping them in a perpetual state of mourning. Eleanor realized that she would need to complete the ritual to free them, to break the curse that held them captive. On the night of the full moon, Eleanor gathered the items she would need: a candle, a locket she had found in the cellar, and a handful of herbs she had read about in the ritual instructions. She prepared the altar in the small, hidden room, her hands steady despite the fear that gnawed at her. As she lit the candle, a soft, eerie light filled the room, casting long shadows on the walls. She held the locket close, whispering the words she had memorized, words meant to guide the spirits to the afterlife. "Walker," she murmured, her voice trembling. "If you can hear me, I am here to set you free. Find peace and let go of this world." The candle flickered, and for a brief moment, Eleanor thought she saw a figure standing beside her, a little old girl with wide, innocent eyes, her face etched with sadness. Emma's spirit lingered, her gaze filled with a gratitude that brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. Slowly, Emma's form began to fade, dissolving into the shadows. Spread through her, a gentle, comforting presence that wrapped around her like a protective cloak. She knew, in that moment, that the spirits had been freed, that the mansion's curse had finally been lifted. As she left the room, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settle over her. The shadows were gone, the whispers silenced. The mansion, once a place of sorrow and despair, was now a sanctuary of memories, a reminder of the love that had endured even beyond death. Eleanor stepped out into the dawn, her heart light with the knowledge that she had done what she could to bring peace to those who had been lost. The mansion was no longer haunted, but alive with the quiet presence of those who had finally found rest. Days after Eleanor completed the ritual, an unexpected calm settled over the mansion. The air felt lighter, as if the heavy, oppressive weight that had once filled each room had lifted, allowing sunlight to seep through in a way that felt warm and welcoming. Eleanor had begun to feel a strange sense of ownership over the mansion, as if she were now its protector. Yet, something tugged at her, a feeling that her work was not entirely done. One evening, Eleanor sat with the diary. She'd found the fragile, faded journal that had once belonged to Emma Walker. She turned its pages slowly, feeling as though the words were whispering secrets directly to her. There was a page she hadn't seen before. A few words faintly scrawled, as if hastily written. "Find me by the willow tree. Beneath its roots lies the heart of the house." The message sent a chill down her spine, and she knew she had to follow it, even if the thought of disturbing the ground beneath the old willow tree felt unsettling. Eleanor had noticed the tree from her first days at the mansion, a massive, ancient willow, whose branches cascaded like curtains down to the ground, shrouding its base in shadow. She'd never dared to approach it, as though those trees you grabbing for a child, set to those. Some invisible force was keeping her away, but now, with renewed resolve, she gathered a lantern, a small trowel, and a heavy jacket before venturing outside. The night was silent, the air crisp as she approached the willow. The moon was silent. "Hi, casting an eerie light over the tree's twisted branches. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped forward, brushing aside the hanging branches and crouching down at its roots. She began to dig, her hands moving slowly, feeling a strange reverence as though she were disturbing a long-buried memory. The earth was cold and damp, but after a few minutes of digging, her trowel struck something hard. She brushed away the soil, revealing a small wooden box, its surface withered with oil.
Why nu shots day right users at where I read the show woman break you
As surface weathered age. With trembling hands, she opened the box, finding inside a collection of objects that seemed out of place: small toys, pieces of jewelry, and letters written in a child's scrawl. Among the items was a note, carefully folded and yellowed with time. Eleanor held it up, her heart racing as she read the faint words. "Dear Mama, I am here with you, always. Please don't cry. I'll be here until you're ready to leave with me. I love you." Eleanor's throat tightened as she realized that Emma had written this note for her mother. It was a final message, one last attempt to bridge the gap between life and death, to assure her mother that she was still near, watching over her. Eleanor understood then that this very spot, was the heart of the mansion, the place where love and loss were forever entwined. As she held the note, Eleanor felt a shift in the air. A soft breeze rustled through the branches, and for a moment she thought she saw two figures standing together beneath the tree, Emma and her mother, their forms shimmering in the moonlight. They stood hand in hand, their faces peaceful, and Eleanor felt a wave of warmth wash over her, a feeling of gratitude that seemed to radiate from the spirits themselves. They nodded at her, their expressions filled with a quiet joy, before slowly fading into the night, their souls finally at rest. Eleanor wiped a tear from her cheek, placing the note back in the box and carefully burying it once more. She knew that the house and the willow tree would hold these memories forever, a testament to the bond that could not be broken, even by death. As she walked back to the mansion, Eleanor felt an overwhelming sense of peace. She had helped the spirits find closure, and in doing so, she had found a purpose, a connection to the history of this place that she knew would stay with her forever. For years, Michael had heard stories about the small, secluded cabin deep in the woods of Crayford. Hidden off the beaten path, it was said to have been abandoned for decades, an old hunting lodge that the forest had nearly reclaimed. The locals whispered about it as though it held dark secrets, warning curious hikers to steer clear. But to Michael and his friends, the stories sounded like a perfect adventure. One crisp October morning, Michael and his three closest friends, Jason, Claire, and Lila, set out on a weekend trip to Crayford. They were all city kids, used to the concrete and bustling noise, and the promise of a quiet retreat felt like an escape. Michael, the most daring of the group, had suggested they venture into the woods to find the cabin. To him, it was more than a simple trip. It was a test of courage, a way to experience the thrill that city life could never provide. The drive was long, winding through narrow roads that twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the unknown. The trees loomed over the car, thick with autumn leaves that blocked out the sun, casting a perpetual shadow over the road. As they reached the edge of the forest, Jason parked the car, and they reached the edge of the forest. Jason parked the car, and they gathered their bags, filled with supplies for a weekend in the wild. "Are you sure about this?" Claire asked, her voice laced with doubt as she glanced at the dense trees surrounding them. "Come on, Claire," Michael replied with a grin, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "It's just an old cabin. Nothing's going to happen." Despite his confident words, Michael felt a faint chill run down his spine. He ignored it, brushing off the feeling as simple excitement. They followed an old, barely visible trail, Michael leading the way, his compass and map in hand. After hours of foot trekking through the undergrowth, the forest seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The air felt thick, and an unnatural silence hung over the woods, as though even the birds dared not break the stillness. Claire, usually talkative, had grown quiet, her gaze darting between the towering trees. Finally, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, they saw it, the cabin. It stood in a small clearing, half hidden by vines and overgrown weeds. The wood was aged and weathered, with sections of the walls missing and the windows shattered. The roof sagged, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. But despite its dilapidated state, the cabin had a strange allure, a sense that it had been waiting, watching, as if it had been waiting, watching, as if it had been waiting, held memories buried beneath its crumbling walls. "Looks cozy," Jason joked, his attempt to lighten a mood falling flat as the others stared at the cabin in silence. They stepped forward cautiously, crossing the threshold into the cabin. The air was stale and cold, smelling of damp wood and decay. Dust floated in the beams of their flashlights as they examined the room, revealing broken furniture and rotting wood. There was an old stone fireplace at the far end, its edges blackened with soot. As they settled in, setting their sleeping bags in a circle around the fireplace, Claire shivered, rubbing her arms. "Why is it so cold in here?" she whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. Michael shrugged, though he felt it too a chill that seemed to sink into his bones, colder than the autumn air outside. He glanced around, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over them. They were just tired, he told himself. After all, it had been a long hike. They lit a small fire in the fireplace, and the warmth eased some of the tension in the room. They shared stories, laughing and joking, the crackling of the fire filling the silence. But as the night wore on, the laughter faded, and a heavy quiet settled over the cabin. Lila was the first to notice it. "Do you guys hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They all froze, listening intently. At first, there was nothing but the crackling of the fire, but then, faint and almost imperceptible, they heard it, a soft, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps echoing from somewhere deep within the cabin. Michael's heart raced as he tried to place the sound. "It's just the wind," he said, though he didn't believe his own words. But the sound persisted, growing louder, until it seemed to be coming from just outside the door. Jason's face was pale, his hands clenched tightly around his flashlight. Maybe it's an animal?" Claire suggested, though her voice trembled, betraying her fear. Michael stood, his flashlight in hand, and took a cautious step toward the door. He pressed his ear against the wood, listening. The footsteps had stopped, leaving only silence. He let out a breath, relieved, and turned back to the group. But then, without warning, the door swung open with a loud creak, as though pushed by an invisible hand. They all jumped back, their flashlights cutting through the darkness beyond the door, but there was nothing there, only the dense forest, silent and unmoving. A chill ran down Michael's spine, and he quickly closed the door, bolting it shut. The group exchanged uneasy glances, each of them feeling the same creeping dread. "This place is strange," Lila whispered, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. The others nodded, too unsettled to speak. They huddled closer to the fire, each of them aware that sleep would not come easily. The cabin seemed to breathe around them, the old wood creaking and groaning as though alive. As the night dragged on, they took turns keeping watch, their eyes darting to every shadow, every flicker of movement. The footsteps never returned, but an unshakable sense of dread lingered, filling the air like a heavy fog. In the early hours of the morning, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the broken windows, they finally allowed themselves to relax, their exhaustion overpowering their fear. But as Michael drifted off, a thought gnawed at the back of his mind, a sense that the cabin had only just begun to reveal its secrets. As dawn broke over the forest, Michael was the first to wake, his body stiff from the cold ground. The fire had died during the night, leaving only embers and a faint warmth in its wake. He glanced around the cabin, feeling a strange sense of relief that daylight had returned. The eerie sounds of the previous night felt distant, almost like a dream, but the unease lingered. One by one, the others stirred, blinking as they adjusted to the morning light that filtered through the cracks in the cabin walls. Lila stretched, her face pale as she avoided looking at the door. Did anyone else hear footsteps last night? She asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason gave a short, humorless laugh. Yeah, and I kept thinking it was just an animal. But now, his words trailed off as he glanced at the door, his expression troubled, wrapping her jacket tighter around herself. It felt like someone was out there, watching us, she murmured, her eyes darting around the cabin. Michael forced a reassuring smile, though he felt the same fear gnawing at him. Look, we probably just freaked ourselves out. Old cabins make weird noises, right? But even as he spoke, he knew his words rang hollow. There had been something unnatural about those footsteps, something deliberate. They decided to explore the surrounding area, hoping that daylight would ease their tension. The forest felt less intimidating in the morning light, the towering trees casting dappled shadows over the ground as they walked. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, the scent of earth and pine filling the air. But even in the daylight, there was a peculiar silence. No birds singing, no rustling of small animals. It was as if the forest itself held its breath, waiting. After a short while, they stumbled upon a small clearing. At its center stood a large, ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching skyward. The bark was blackened, scarred by what looked like claw marks etched deeply into its surface. Lila stepped closer, running her fingers over the grooves, her expression one of both fascination and unease. Do you think these marks were made by an animal? She asked, turning to Michael. He shook his head slowly. The marks were too precise, too deliberate, as though someone or something had left them as a warning. I don't know, he admitted, but it doesn't look natural. Jason knelt down, inspecting something on the ground near the tree. He brushed away a layer of leaves, revealing an old, rusted hunting knife partially buried in the dirt. He picked it up, examining the blade, which was covered in dried mud and faint red stains. This thing looks ancient, he muttered, holding it up for the others to see. Claire took a step back, her eyes widening. Why would someone leave a knife here? She asked, her voice trembling. Michael frowned, a sense of dread creeping over him. Maybe it belonged to one of the hunters who used to come out here. He suggested, though he didn't fully believe it himself. The knife felt out of place, like a relic from a dark past. They returned to the cabin, the strange discovery hanging over them, like a dark cloud. Jason placed the knife on the fireplace mantel, its rusty blade catching the light in a way that seemed almost ominous. They spent the rest of the day exploring the area, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the silence of the forest weighed heavily on them. As evening approached, they gathered around the fire once more, their laughter and conversation subdued. The memory of the footsteps and the eerie silence of the forest lingered in their minds, a reminder of the strange events they had yet to fully understand. Do you think the stories about this place are true? Lila asked suddenly, her eyes reflecting the glow of the fire. What stories? Claire asked, her gaze wary. Michael shifted uncomfortably, realizing he hadn't told them everything he'd heard about the cabin. He hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "I heard some locals say that people used to go missing here. Hunters, hikers. They'd disappear, and no one would ever find them. Some think it's because of the forest, that it keeps people," Jason scoffed, though his expression betrayed his unease. "Come on, that's just a story to scare tourists. People gone, that's just a story to scare tourists missing in the woods all the time." "Maybe," Michael replied, though the words felt hollow. "But we can't deny that something's off about this place." The fire crackled, filling the silence that followed, and they sat in uneasy contemplation. As darkness fell, they retreated into their sleeping bags, the warmth of the fire fading as they lay in the dim light. The silence grew oppressive, wrapping around them like a suffocating blanket. Lila and Claire huddled closer, together, their faces tense, while Michael and Jason lay on opposite sides, their eyes scanning the shadows. Just as Michael was about to drift off, he heard it again, the soft, rhythmic thumping that had haunted them the night before. He heard it again, the soft, rhythmic thumping that had haunted them the night before. Tensed, his eyes wide open as he strained to listen. The sound was closer this time, the footsteps slow and deliberate, as though someone were pacing outside the cabin. He glanced at Jason, who met his gaze, his expression one of terror. They didn't dare move, barely breathing as the footsteps grew louder, circling the cabin. The air felt colder, and Michael's breath came in short, shallow gasps. The footsteps stopped, and for a brief, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Michael's heart raced as he struggled to make sense of what he was seeing. There was no one there, no figure, no shadow, just an empty doorway leading into the dark forest. He could feel an invisible presence, a cold, unearthly energy that seemed to seep into the cabin, filling the room with a sense of dread. He wanted to close the door, to shut out whatever lurked beyond, but his body wouldn't obey. It was as though he were paralyzed, held captive by the fear that gripped him. Finally, the door swung shut on its own, the heavy thud echoing through the cabin. The footsteps faded into silence, leaving the group huddled together, too terrified to speak. They lay awake for hours, their eyes wide open, each of them listening for the return of the footsteps. But the night passed in silence, the strange presence fading with the first light of dawn. When morning came, they gathered their things, deciding to leave the cabin. The sense of adventure had been replaced by a primal fear, an instinct to survive that overpowered their curiosity. But as they turned to leave, Michael glanced back, his gaze lingering on the cabin. Couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching them, that something within the shadows was waiting, biding its time. And as they walked away, the forest seemed to close in around them. The silence heavy with unspoken secrets, the memories of those who had come before and never left. After they packed up and left the cabin behind, the group walked in silence, the weight of their experience settling heavily on them. The eerie presence of the previous night had stripped away any thrill they'd felt about the trip, leaving only an uneasy quiet. As they made their way back toward the trail, the forest seemed to press in on them, the towering trees creating a dark canopy that blocked out much of the morning light. Michael led the cheers that Cole how was partners. Sobster crime east I thought Jow lay. His eyes fixed on the compass in his hand, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The trail they'd followed to reach the cabin seemed to have vanished overnight, replaced by dense thickets and tangled roots that made it nearly impossible to walk in a straight line. Jason, who had been quiet since they left, finally spoke up, his voice low. "Erwe, lost?" Michael stopped, glancing around as he tried to find some familiar landmark, anything that could guide them. But everything looked the same trees, the same thick underbrush, as if the forest itself were shifting around them, leading into them deeper into its heart. "We can't be lost," he insisted, though he didn't fully believe it himself. "We just need to keep moving." They continued walking, each of them growing more tense with every step. The silence of the forest felt unnatural, oppressive, as though the very air were thick with secrets. Even Claire, who had been the most reluctant to come on the trip, kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale with fear. As they rounded a bend, they came upon a small oak clearing. At its center stood a weathered stone marker, its surface covered in moss and lichen. The stone was tall and narrow, with strange symbols carved into its surface, symbols that seemed both ancient and familiar, like a forgotten language etched into the earth. "What is this?" Lila whispered, her eyes wide as she took a step back. Michael knelt down, brushing away the moss to reveal more of the markings. The symbols were faint, worn away by time, but he could make out a few shapes, circles, crosses, and strange, jagged lines that formed a spiral pattern. "I've seen these before," he murmured, his mind racing as he tried to remember where. Claire took a step closer, her gaze fixed on the stone. "Do you think it's some kind of grave?" The thought sent a chill down Michael's spine, and he quickly stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. The idea that they were standing in a place where someone had been buried, lost to time and forgotten by the world, filled him with a deep sense of dread. "We should keep moving," he said, his voice tight. "We need to find the trail before it gets dark." But as they turned to leave, a sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint, mournful sound, a whisper, almost too quiet to hear, that seemed to come from the very ground beneath their feet. "Stay!" The word was barely audible, but it sent a shiver down each of their spines. They exchanged uneasy glances, the fear in their eyes reflecting back at one another. Michael's heart raced as he tried to push away the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. "Did you hear that?" Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. They all nodded, their faces pale as they looked around, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. But the clearing was empty, silent once more, as though the whisper had been nothing more than an after, a figment of their imagination. "Let's go," Claire urged, her voice trembling. She grabbed Lila's arm, pulling her toward the edge of the clearing. Michael led the way, his pace quickening as they left the stone marker behind. But the further they should carrying, trace size, the anchor of another zero. They walked, the more disoriented they became. The trees grew denser, the undergrowth thicker, and the light dimmed as dark clouds gathered overhead, casting a shadow over the forest. After what felt like hours of wandering, they stumbled upon hours of wandering. They stumbled upon another clearing. Michael's heart sank as he realized it was the same clearing, the same stone marker standing at its center, the symbols etched into its surface. "This isn't possible," Lila whispered, her voice filled with panic. "We've been walking in circles." Jason clenched his fists, his face twisted with frustration. "How is that even possible?" "We've been walking in the same direction this whole time." Michael took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. Maybe we should rest for a while. We can figure out what to do once we've had a chance to calm down." Reluctantly, they agreed, settling down in the clearing as they tried to make sense of their situation. The forest was silent, save for the faint rustling of leaves as the wind picked up, carrying with it a chill that seemed to seep into their bones. As they sat into their bones, in uneasy silence, Claire suddenly spoke, her voice low. "Do you guys remember the stories? The ones about the people who went missing here?" They all turned to her, their faces pale as they nodded. The stories had been part of what drew them to the cabin. Tales of hikers who had ventured into the forest, never to return. But now, those stories felt all too real. the weight of them settling over them like a dark cloud. I always thought they were just stories, Claire continued, her voice shaking. But what if they're true? Michael's mind raced as he tried to come up with a rational explanation, something that would make sense of the strange occurrences. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that there was no logical explanation. The forest was an enigma, a place that seemed to defy reason, and he was beginning to understand why the locals had warned them to stay away. Just then, the wind picked up again, swirling through the clearing in a gust that sent leaves and dirt flying. The air grew colder, and a low, mournful sound filled the clearing, like the distant wail of a lost soul. Lila clutched Michael's arm, her face filled with terror. What? What is that? The sound grew louder, filling the air with a sense of sorrow and despair. It was a voice, but not a human voice, an otherworldly moan that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth, filling the forest with a haunting melody, Michael's heart with a haunting complaint.
Why, how it shook the station? Michael's bars ear balsary.
Michael's heart raced as he stood, his eyes scanning the trees. He could feel the presence of something unseen, something that watched them from the shadows, waiting for them to make a move. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice filled with out of here. He said, his voice filled with urgency. Now. The others didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their bags, following Michael as he led them back into the forest, their footsteps echoing in the silent woods. But no matter how far they walked, the sound followed them, growing louder, more insistent, as though the forest itself were trying to hold them in its grasp. They stumbled over roots and branches, their hearts pounding as they pushed forward, desperation driving them onward. But the forest seemed driving them onward, endless, a labyrinth of shadows and trees that twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the unknown. Finally, they broke through the undergrowth, finding themselves at the edge of a cliff. Below, the forest stretched out like a sea of a cliff. Below, the forest stretched out like a sea of darkness, and they could see the cabin in the distance, a small speck amidst the endless trees. Michael felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. As they looked down, they saw figures moving among the trees, shadowy shapes that darted between the trunks, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. What are they?" Lila whispered, her voice filled with terror. Michael couldn't answer. He could only stare, his heart pounding as he watched the figures move closer, their movements slow and deliberate, like predators stalking their prey. They had entered the forest willingly, but now, as the shadows closed in, they realized that the forest had no intention of letting them go. As the shadowy figures moved closer, Michael felt a primal fear grip him. They were far from safety, surrounded by a forest that seemed to close in with every passing second. The dense canopy of branches above turned the midday sky into twilight, casting a dim, eerie glow over the cliffside. Every instinct told him to run, but he knew they were trapped, with nowhere to go but down into the forest, closer to the approaching shapes. Lila clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Michael, what are they?" He forced himself to speak, though his voice was barely more than a whisper. "I don't know, but we can't stay here." Jason, always the skeptical one, was visibly shaken, his eyes darting between the cliff and the woods below. "There has to be a way out. We'll circle back around the cliff. We can find another path." His tone lacked the usual bravado, a hollow sound that betrayed his own fear. They retreated slowly, their backs pressed against the cliff's edge, moving sideways, hoping to find a path around. But the shadowy figures were relentless, their movements inhumanly smooth and silent, like shadows brought to life. As they drew nearer, Michael could make out faint details, pale faces, eyes devoid of emotion, their mouths moving soundlessly, as if chanting some unearthly incantation. Suddenly, one of the figures broke away from the group, gliding toward them. Claire gasped, stumbling as she backed into a loose patch of dirt. She clung to Michael, her face pale with terror. "Michael, please, do something," she cried, her voice trembling, with no other choice. He took a deep breath and led the group away from the cliff, pushing through the undergrowth. The forest seemed to grow darker as they moved, the shadows deepening around them, swallowing the faint light. Every step felt heavy, as though the ground were pulling them down, rooting them to the forest floor. They ran in silence, their breaths ragged, the weight of fear pressing down on them. Branches scraped against their skin, roots seemed to reach out, tripping them, as if the forest itself were conspiring against them. After what felt like an eternity, they stumbled into another clearing, collapsing to the ground in exhaustion. The clearing was eerily silent. The clearing was eerily silent, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. Michael glanced around, trying to catch his breath. He could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears, each beat a reminder of the terror that had chased them here. Jason was the first to speak. His was the first to speak, voice a mixture of disbelief and desperation. "This isn't real. It can't be real. We're just lost. We'll find our way out." Michael shook his head, the hopelessness settling over him like a heavy fog. "This place, it's not normal. It's like it's keeping us here, trapping us." Lila shuddered, hugging her knees to her chest. "I've read about places like this," she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Places that are cursed, that trap anyone who enters, twisting reality, keeping them lost forever." Claire buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "We should have listened to the locals. They warned us." The silence that followed was heavy, each of them lost in their own thoughts, their own fears. The forest seemed to press in closer, as if listening, waiting. As they sat in the clearing, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached their ears, a faint melody, drifting through the trees like a lullaby. It was hauntingly beautiful, yet deeply unsettling. A song that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Lila tilted her head, her eyes unfocused. Do you hear that?" They all nodded, each of them captivated by the melody. It was a song that seemed to reach deep into their souls, stirring emotions they couldn't explain. Michael felt a strange compulsion to follow the sound, as though the melody helped the help. The answers they sought without thinking. He rose to his feet, moving toward the source of the music. The others followed, their movements almost trance-like. Drawn by the haunting song, they pushed through the trees, the music growing louder with each step, guiding them deeper into the heart of the forest. Finally, they reached another clearing, larger than the last. At its center stood an old stone well, its edges covered in moss and vines. The melody seemed to emanate from within, echoing up from the depths. Michael approached the well, peering over the edge. The darkness within was absolute, a void that seemed to swallow the light. The melody continued, growing softer, as though retreating further into the cell. I hear all retreating further into the depths. "Do you think something's down there?" Jason asked, his voice barely a whisper. Michael nodded, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "It feels alive, like it's waiting for us." Claire shivered, backing away from the well. "This place is wrong. We need to get out of here. But, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that the well held answers. Ignoring Claire's protests, he searched the ground nearby, finding a loose rock. He dropped it into the well, listening as it fell, the sound echoing down into the depths. There was a long, eerie silence, and then from deep within, a voice echoed up, faint and distorted, as though coming from another world. "Help me!" The words sent a chill down their spines, freezing them in place. It was the voice of a child. It was the voice of a child, filled with fear and desperation, a plea that seemed to reach across time and space. Did you hear that?" Lila whispered, her eyes wide with horror. They all nodded, their faces pale as they stared at the well. The voice continued, growing fainter as though receding further into the darkness. "Please, help." Michael took a step back, his mind racing. The voice was real, unmistakably so. But how could there be someone down there? The well looked ancient, untouched for years. He turned to the others, his voice shaking. We have to do something. We can't just leave." Claire shook her head. Fear etched into her face. "Michael, this place is evil. Whatever's down there, it's not human." Jason grabbed Michael's arm, his grip tight. "She's right. We don't know what we're dealing with. This place is cursed." But Michael couldn't shake the voice, the plea for help that had echoed from the well. He knew. It sounded crazy, but he felt a responsibility, a need to answer the call. "We have to try," he insisted, his voice filled with determination. "We came here looking for adventure. Maybe this is it." Reluctantly, the others agreed. Though fear was clear in their eyes. Michael found a length of rope nearby, old and frayed but strong enough to hold his weight. He tied it to the edge of the well, testing it before lowering himself over the side. The darkness swallowed him as he descended, the walls of the well cold and damp. The air grew colder with each foot, the temperature dropping to an unnatural chill. He could feel the weight of the earth pressing down on him, the darkness becoming almost suffocating. As he heeled, the weight suffocating, reached the bottom, his flashlight flickered, casting a dim light over the damp stone floor. The silence was absolute, a void that seemed to absorb all sound. He looked around, his heart pounding, searching for the source of the voice. And then he saw it, a small, tattered doll lying in the dirt, its face smeared with mud, its eyes staring blankly into the darkness. It was old, worn, as though it had been down there for decades. Michael picked up the doll, a chill running down there for decades. Michael picked up the doll, his spine. The air grew colder, and he felt a presence, something ancient and malevolent, watching him from the shadows. Just then, the voice echoed again, closer this time, filling the darkness with a chilling whisper. "Help me?" Michael's heart raced as he looked around. His flashlight flickering the darkness seemed to close in, the walls of the well pressing closer, as though the forest itself were trying to trap him. He scrambled up the rope, his hands slipping on the damp stone, desperate to escape. As he climbed, he felt something cold brush against his leg, a whisper of movement in the darkness. When he finally reached the top, the others pulled him out, their faces filled with relief and fear. He collapsed, filled with relief and fear. On the ground, gasping for breath, the doll still clutched in his hand. They didn't speak, the weight of the experience settling over them like a dark cloud. The voice, the well, the forest, it all felt like a nightmare they couldn't wake. And as they left the clearing, the faint melody resumed, drifting through the trees, a reminder that the forest was watching, waiting, its secrets hidden in the shadows. The silence among the group grew heavier as they left the clearing. Each of them was burdened by a sense of dread they couldn't shake. The forest had become something sinister, a dark presence lurking around every tree, hiding in the shadows, whispering secrets they were never meant to hear. Michael held the doll tightly, feeling its weight as if it were an anchor to something dark and ancient. They trudged through the dense undergrowth, the path unclear and winding. The trees seemed to close in tighter, forming a maze that left them more and more disoriented. The forest had transformed from an adventure into a trap, and the looming canopy above blocked out the light, casting everything in shadow. "Are we going the right way?" Lila's voice was barely a whisper, tinged with desperation. She scanned the forest, her eyes wide, as if expecting something to leap from behind the trees at any moment. Michael checked his compass, but the needle spun erratically, unable to settle on a direction. I don't know," he admitted, his voice strained. The realization hit him hard. They were truly lost. The group exchanged anxious glances, the reality of their situation sinking in. The path they'd taken to the cabin seemed to have vanished, replaced by thick brambles and twisted roots that reached out like grasping fingers. It was as if the forest itself was alive, shifting and reshaping to keep them trapped. Hours passed, marked only by their growing fatigue and fear. The sun, hidden behind thick clouds, offered no sense of time, and soon it became impossible to tell how long they'd been walking. Every tree looked the same, and the eerie silence pressed down on them, amplifying every silence pressed down on them, amplifying every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig. Eventually, they stumbled upon a small, overgrown clearing. At its center was a circle of stones, arranged in a way that seemed deliberate, as though marking something ancient and forgotten. In the middle of the circle was a patch of bare earth, dark and disturbed, as if freshly dug. Claire stepped forward cautiously, her gaze fixed on the stones. It feels like a grave." Michael's eyes narrowed as he studied the ground. The barrowed earth seemed to pulse with a strange energy, an almost magnetic pull that drew him closer. The doll in his hand felt heavy, as though it were connected to whatever lay beneath the soil. Jason took a step back, his face pale. "We need to get out of here. This place. It's wrong." All of it, but Michael couldn't move. He knelt by the disturbed earth, a strange compulsion driving him to dig, to uncover whatever was hidden beneath. His fingers clawed at the dirt, heedless of the fair scratches and scrapes that covered his hands. Lila grabbed his shoulder, trying to pull him back. "Michael, stop. You don't know what's down there." But he ignored her, his hands digging deeper, driven by an inexplicable need to find what lay buried. And then, with a final scrape of his fingers, he uncovered something hard and cold, a small metal box, rusted and worn by time. He lifted it from the earth, his breath catching as he held it in his hands. The box was covered in strange symbols, similar to the ones they'd seen on the stone marker earlier. It felt heavy, filled with secrets that had been hidden away for centuries. Claire took a step back, her face twisted in fear. "Don't open it, Michael. Whatever's inside, it's not meant for us." But he couldn't resist. His fingers trembled as he pried open the lid, revealing a collection of old, faded letters, tied letters, together with a frayed piece of ribbon. Beneath the letters lay a small lock of hair, brittle and yellowed with age. He unfolded one of the letters, his hands shaking as he read the faded, spidery handwriting.
"To whoever finds this, I beg you, whoever finds this, I beg you,
leave this place. The forest holds our sins, our secrets, and our sorrow. Those who stay are doomed to become part of it, bound by its darkness. Leave before it claims you as it claimed us." The words sent a chill down his spine, and he quickly closed the box, his heart pounding. The message was clear. This forest was cursed, a place that trapped souls and held them in eternal darkness. And now, they were part of it. Jason looked at him, his face pale. "Michael, We need to leave now. But as they turned to go, a soft whisper drifted through the clearing, carried by a cold, unnatural wind. Stay! The word echoed in their minds, filling them with a terror that rooted them in place. The shadows around them grew darker, twisting and shifting, forming shapes that seemed almost human. They watched, frozen, as the shadows solidified, taking on the forms of the people who had come before them, lost souls trapped by the forest, bound to its darkness, one to its darkness. By one, the shadows stepped forward, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty. They reached out, their hands outstretched, as though begging for release, for freedom from the forest's grip. Michael stumbled back, his heart racing as he tried to escape the grasping hands, but the shadows moved closer, their whispers filling the air, growing louder, more insistent. Help us! Free us! Lila screamed, clutching at Michael's arm. Michael, do something! But he was paralyzed, trapped by the weight of the forest's curse, the realization that there was no escape. The forest had claimed them, as it had claimed all those before, binding them to its darkness. Jason and Claire pulled him back, their voices desperate as they urged him to run. They turned and fled, the shadows close behind, their whispers filling the air, growing louder, more desperate. They ran through the forest, their breaths ragged, the shadows pursuing them, reaching out with hands that seemed to stretch and lengthen, grasping at their clothes, their hair. Every step was a struggle, the ground seeming to pull them back, trapping them in the forest's embrace. Just as they thought they couldn't go any further, they stumbled out of the trees and into a familiar clearing. The cabin stood before them, dark and silent, its windows like empty eyes watching them with an unfeeling gaze. They collapsed against the door, gasping for breath, their bodies shaking with fear and exhaustion. The shadows had stopped at the edge of the clearing, hovering just beyond the tree line, watching them with hollow eyes. For a moment, they thought they were safe, but then the whispers returned, faint and distant, drifting through the air like a ghostly chant. You can't leave. You belong to the forest. Michael's heart sank as he realized the truth. The forest had marked them, bound them to its curse. They were part of it now, their souls forever tied to its darkness. They retreated into the cabin, barricading the door, their breaths shallow as they listened to the whispers outside, the faint sound of footsteps moving around the cabin. The shadows watched them, waiting, patient and unrelenting. And as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, filling the cabin with the sound of lost souls, of voices trapped in the darkness, calling out for release. But Michael knew there was no escape. They were part of the forest now, bound to its secrets, its sorrow, and its shadows. The forest had claimed them, as it had claimed all who had come before. And in the darkness, as the shadows closed in, they understood the true horror of the forest, that once you entered, you could never leave. Emma Lane had never felt a deep connection to her family. Growing up, her childhood memories were a collection of brief, uncomfortable visits to her mother's side of the family, filled with silences and sidelong glances. But after her mother's side, at the family Kelkshires, and your Gerrit's sudden passing, Emma found herself the last living member of the Lane family, with only one item left to her name: a massive, remote manor, perched on the outskirts of a town she hadn't seen in years. The locals called it the Silent Manor, a title earned from generations of isolation and rumor. It was a place spoken of in whispers, a manor avoided by the town folk and hidden among towering trees and mist-covered hills, even from a distance. The house loomed like a shadow against the sky. its stone walls darkened by years of neglect. After the long drive, Emma approached the manor's grand gates, which creaked open with a rusty groan. The path leading up to the house was overgrown, thick with brambles that scraped against her legs as she walked. The manor itself stood tall, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring back at her. Vines crawled up the sides, twisting around the columns and railings, as though nature itself was trying to reclaim the building. Steeling herself, she stepped through the massive front doors, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty foyer. The air inside was cold, stale, and filled with a faint, musty scent. Dust floated in the beams of light streaming through the cracked windows, illuminating the grand staircase that spiraled up into the shadows above. The silence was palpable, pressing down on her like a weight. The entire house seemed to breathe in sync with her, as if it had been waiting for her return. Portraits lined the walls, each one a face from the Lane family's long and troubled history. Their eyes seemed to follow her as she walked, and she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though she knew she was alone. She knew she was alone. She knew she was alone. Wandered through the rooms, her fingers trailing along dusty furniture and faded wallpaper. Each room felt more forgotten than the last, frozen in time, filled with relics of lives long past. It was as though the house itself was a tomb, preserving the memories and secrets of the Lane family, waiting for someone to uncover them. That first night, Emma felt an unusual tension in the air. As darkness settled over the manor, the silence grew heavier, almost suffocating. She found herself unable to sleep, tossing and turning as a strange sense of unease settled over her. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing deeper, stretching into shapes that shouldn't exist. Just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, a faint, indistinct whisper echoing through the stillness of her room. Her heart raced as she sat up, listening intently. The whisper was soft, almost imperceptible, but she could make out a word or two, words that seemed to come from the very word or two. Walls? Emma returned. Her skin prickled with fear, and she told herself it was just her mind playing tricks, the result of exhaustion in the unfamiliar setting. But as the whisper faded, a cold draft swept through the room, sending a chill down her spine. In the days that followed, Emma tried to dismiss the experience, telling herself it was nothing. But the feeling of being watched lingered, growing stronger with each passing day. The house seemed to come alive at night, without creaks and groans that echoed through the halls, as though it were settling in, preparing for something. On the third night, she heard footsteps. They were faint, distant, as though someone were walking down the hall just outside her bedroom door. She lay still, her heart pounding, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped right outside her door, and for a moment, she thought she saw a shadow pass beneath the crack. Summoning her courage, Emma got out of bed and opened the door, only to find an empty hallway stretching out before her, bathed in darkness. But as she closed the door, she noticed something that hadn't been there before: a single wilted rose lying on the floor, its petals dark and shriveled. Confused and unnerved, she picked up the rose, feeling a strange heaviness in her chest. It felt like a message, a reminder of something she couldn't quite remember. She placed the rose on her bedside table, hoping it was a one-time occurrence. But as the nights passed, more strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own, doors creaked open without warning, and shadows flickered at the edge of her vision. The whispers grew louder, more persistent, filling the thick silence with words she couldn't understand. She began to feel as though she were being pulled deeper into the manor's secrets, drawn into a web of memories and mysteries she was never meant to uncover. One night, she awoke to find herself standing in the hallway, her hand resting on the banister of the grand staircase. She had no memory of leaving her bed, no idea how she had ended up there. But as she stood in the darkness, she felt a presence behind her, a cold, heavy weight pressing down on her shoulders. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, but there was no one there, just the silent, empty hall stretching out before her, filled with shadows that seemed to pulse with life as she made her way back to her room. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to uncover the truth. And she knew, deep down, that the manor held more than just memories. It held the ghosts of her family's past, waiting for her to face them. As the days wore on, Emma felt the house pulling her deeper into its grip. Each room seemed to hold a fragment of the past, a glimpse into lives she knew little of. She began exploring each day, hoping to uncover answers, to make sense of the whispers, the footsteps, and the strange, chilling presence she felt every night. But with each discovery, her fear only deepened, as if the house were deliberately keeping its secrets just out of reach. On the fifth day, Emma stumbled upon a locked door at the end of the east wing, a part of the house she hadn't yet explored. The door was old, its wood darkened with age, and the brass keyhole gleamed as though polished by years of curious hands trying to unlock it. She tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The door felt solid, immovable, as though it were guarding something important. Determined to get inside, Emma searched the house for a key, checking every drawer, every cabinet, even under loose floorboards. Finally, in a dusty corner of the library, she found a small brass key hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. Her heart raced as she returned to the locked door, the key clutched tightly in her hand. She slipped the key into the hand lock, turning it slowly. The door creaked open, revealing a dark room beyond. The air inside was cold, stale, filled with the scent of decay and something faintly metallic. Emma hesitated, her instincts telling her to turn back. But her curiosity won out. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering in from a small, cracked window. The room was sparsely furnished, with only a single chair and an old, battered desk. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten threads of the past. On the desk lay a large, leather-bound journal, its cover worn and faded with the initials, Great-Grandfather, Edward Lane, a man she knew little about, except for the rumors of his madness in his later years. Her fingers trembled as she opened the journal, the brittle pages crackling under her touch. The handwriting was neat, precise, yet grew increasingly erratic as she flipped through the pages. The entries were filled with strange symbols, cryptic notes, and fragmented thoughts, as though Edward's mind had unraveled within these very pages. One entry, written near the end, caught her attention. "I have seen them, the spirits that linger here. They watch, they wait. Trapped between this world and the next, I am bound to them, as is my bloodline. They are not at rest, and they never will be not, until someone frees them." A chill ran down Emma's spine as she read the words. She could feel Edward's fear, his desperation, bleeding through the ink. The house had been haunted even in his time, plagued by spirits unable to move on, trapped by spirits unable to move on. Trapped within its walls, she continued reading, each entry growing darker, more frantic. Edward spoke of voices, of shadows that moved in the night, of things lurking just beyond sight. He wrote about strange rituals, about attempts to communicate with the spirits, to understand what kept them bound to the manor, but every attempt had ended in failure. leaving him tormented, consumed by the very forces he sought to control. Emma closed the journal, her mind racing. She felt a strange kinship with her great-grandfather, a shared sense of helplessness in the face of the unknown. The manor held secrets that spanned generations, mysteries that had driven her ancestors to madness. And now, it was her turn to confront them. She left the room. The shadows in the hallway seemed darker, more oppressive, as though they had sensed her discovery. She felt the weight of unseen eyes watching her, tracking her every step. The air grew colder, and she quickened her pace, desperate to escape the suffocating presence that lingered in the dark that night. Emma was unable to sleep. She lay in bed, the journal resting on her bedside table, the words haunting her thoughts. The whispers had returned, growing louder, more insistent, filling her mind with fragments of memories, echoes of lives that had come before. Just as she began to drift off, a sharp knock echoed through her room, jolting her awake. She sat up, her heart pounding, staring into the darkness. The knock came again, louder this time, seeming to come from within the walls themselves. She got out of bed, her hands shaking as she moved toward the door. But before she could reach it, the door swung open on its own, revealing an empty hallway beyond. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive with an unseen energy, and she could feel the house watching her, waiting for her to make a move. Swallowing her fear, Emma stepped into the hallway. The silence was thick, pressing down on her as she moved through the shadows, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. She followed an invisible pull, a strange compulsion guiding her down the grand staircase and toward the east wing. As she reached the base wing of the staircase, she saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall, shrouded in shadow. The figure was tall, thin, with an otherworldly presence that sent a chill down her spine. She couldn't make out its features, but she could feel down her spine, its gaze heavy and unrelenting, watching her with an intensity that left her rooted in place. Who are you?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond. It remained still, silent, its form shifting slightly, as though it were part of the darkness itself. And then, slowly, it raised a hand, beckoning her forward. Emma took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but the compulsion was too strong, pulling her forward, deeper into the shadows. She moved closer, her heart racing, each step bringing her closer to the figure. Just as she was about to reach it, the figure vanished, dissolving into the darkness. Emma was left standing alone in the hallway, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. And then, from behind her, she heard it, a soft, barely perceptible whisper. She spun around, her breath catching, but there was no one there, just the empty hallway stretching out before her, filled with shadows and silence. Emma returned to her room, her mind racing, unable to shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something far darker than she could comprehend. The house was alive, aware of her presence, and it wanted something from her. And deep down, she knew that whatever the house was hiding, it would not rest until she had uncovered the truth. The following days passed in a blur of shadows and whispers. Emma felt herself slipping, her sense of time distorted as the house drew her deeper into its grasp. The manor seemed to be alive, breathing around her, its walls pulsing with a worry, hidden life. Each night, the whispers grew louder, the footsteps more distinct, and every room felt colder, more oppressive, as though something unseen lingered just beyond the edge of her vision. One morning, after a sleepless night, Emma stumbled into the dining room, her mind clouded with exhaustion. She stopped short when she saw the table. On its dusty surface lay a pristine white envelope. stark against the worn wood. The envelope was addressed to her in elegant script, her name written as though by a hand that knew her intimately. She reached out, hesitating, before finally lifting the envelope and opening it. Inside was a single note, the handwriting spidery and old. "Do not trust what you see. The house reveals only what it wishes you to know. If you seek the truth, descend into the cellars. There you will find what has been hidden." A chill swept through her, and she glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching her. But she was alone, the silence of the house pressing in on her. The cellars, she had avoided them since her arrival, sensing an unnatural cold emanating from the stone steps that led down into the earth. She'd told herself it was just her imagination, but now the urge to descend into the cellars was undeniable. Armed with only a flashlight and the journal she'd found, she made her way down the winding staircase. Each step echoed in the darkness, the cold air growing sharper with every level. She felt the walls close in around her as though the house itself was trapping her. When she reached the bottom, she found herself in a narrow corridor, its walls lined with crumbling stone. The cellar was silent, save for the faint dripping of water somewhere in the shadows. Emma moved forward, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The smell of damp earth and decay filled the air, thick and suffocating. As she moved further in, she came across a set of iron doors at the Theolin of Durisit Volkwai, the Granme, as she coil freestagim, Gigilwa Fpina the carry, and end of the corridor, their surface rusted and worn with age. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the cold metal, her heart pounding. She could feel a presence beyond the doors, something waiting for her, something that had been hidden away for years. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the doors open. The air inside was icy, filled with a strange, unearthly silence. Her flashlight flickered, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The room was filled with strange artifacts, old mirrors, cracked and covered in dust, ancient-looking trinkets, and a series of portraits, each one depicting a member of her family. The eyes of each portrait seemed to follow her as she moved, their expressions filled with a mix of sorrow and fear. At the far end of the room, she saw a large, ornate chest, its surface carved with strange symbols that seemed to pulse in the dim light. She approached it cautiously, her hands trembling as she traced the carvings. The chest felt cold to the touch, as though it had been hidden away from the warmth of the world for centuries. With a deep breath, she lifted the lid, revealing a collection of documents, old and fragile, filled with accounts of strange rituals and family secrets. Her fingers trembled as she sifted through them, each page revealing a new horror. One document, written in the same spidery handwriting as the note, caught her eye. It was an account of a ritual performed by her great-grandfather, Edward Lane, in an attempt to bind the spirits that haunted the manor. The ritual had gone horribly wrong, trapping the spirits within the house, binding them. Houndtrow, putting a Piers Carunus Ajayuans, still in the house, to the Lane family bloodline. Emma's hands shook as she read the words, the implications sinking in. The spirits, the shadows, the whispers, they were her ancestors, trapped within the walls of the house, bound by her great-grandfathers, Mistake. Just then, a voice echoed through the room, soft and sorrowful. "You shouldn't have come here, Emma." She froze, the flashlight slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. The beam flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. She looked around, her breath coming in short gasps as she searched for the source of the voice. In the corner of the room, she saw a figure, a woman, pale and translucent. Her eyes filled with a haunting sadness. She wore an old-fashioned dress, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders, and her gaze was fixed on Emma with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Who? Who? Who are you? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond. She took a step forward, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. Emma could feel the weight of her gaze, heavy and unrelenting, as though she were staring into her very soul. You must undo what was done, the figure said, her voice barely above a whisper. Free us, release us from this prison. Emma took a step back, her heart pounding as the figure faded into the shadows. The air grew colder, the silence heavier, and she could feel the weight of the spirits pressing down on her, their sorrow and anger filling the room. Desperate to escape, she turned and fled, her footsteps echoing in the corridor as she ran back up the stairs. She could feel the spirits following her, their whispers filling her mind, begging for release, for freedom. When she reached the main floor, she slammed the cellar door shut, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could still feel the presence of the spirits, lingering just beyond the door, watching, waiting. As she tried to catch her breath, a thought began to form in her mind, a way to undo the ritual, to free the spirits and release her family from the curse that bound them to the thirst that bound them to the manor. But she knew that it would not be easy, that the house would fight her every step of the way. And as she stood there, staring at the cellar door, she could feel the weight of her family's past pressing down on her. The responsibility of a family's past pressing down on her. The responsibility of undoing the mistakes of generations. The house was alive, filled with spirits trapped between worlds, bound by blood and darkness, and it would not rest until she had freed them or joined them. As the sun began to set, the manor grew darker, the shadows lengthening across the floors and walls. Emma could feel the house closing in around her, an invisible pressure building in the air. She knew that tonight was the night. If she was going to attempt to undo the ritual, she would have Kafrestes and do the ritual. She would have, to face whatever lay hidden within the house walls. After preparing herself with a flashlight and a journal, she made her way to the grand hall, where the large family portraits loomed over her. The figures in the portraits seemed more lifelike now, their eyes following her as she moved. She took a deep breath, gripping the journal tightly as she read through Edward Lane's ritual notes, trying to decipher the incantations and symbols he'd left behind. One section of the journal detailed the reversal ritual, a series of chants, symbolic gestures, and the arrangement of certain artifacts. Emma collected what she could find from the cellar, her great-grandfather's belongings scattered through the rooms, and the family heirlooms hidden in the attic. She placed each artifact in the center of the hall, arranging them in the shape of a circle, just as Edward had described. The house was silent, the oppressive stillness pressing down on her like a weight. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she opened the journal to the final page. The chant was written in a language she didn't recognize, an ancient dialect that felt foreign, yet strangely familiar. Her voice shook as she began to recite the words, her voice echoing through the empty halls. As she chanted, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so low that her breath became visible in the dim light. The walls seemed to tremble, the shadows flickering as though they were alive. A low hum filled the room, growing louder with each verse of the chant, vibrating through her body and setting her nerves on edge. Then, from the darkness, she saw them shadows slipping through the walls. Figures emerging from the rings, floors, their forms indistinct, yet horrifyingly real. They were her ancestors, the spirits bound to the house, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish and despair. They moved toward her, their eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. Their eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. their hands reaching out as though begging for release. Emma continued to chant, her voice growing stronger as she fought to hold her ground. She could feel the weight of their sorrow pressing down on her, a collective grief that spanned generations, a pain that had been passed down through the bloodline. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the hum. "Let this be enough. Let this set you free." The shadows began to close in, circling her as she completed the final verse of the chant. The room was filled with a blinding light, a burst of energy that knocked her off her feet, sending her sprawling across the floor. She shielded her eyes, the light so intense that it felt like it was burning through her. When the light faded, the silence returned, more profound than before. Emma opened her eyes, her vision blurry as she struggled to make sense of what had happened. The spirits were gone, the room empty, the air still. She could feel a strange warmth spreading through her, a sense of peace that hadn't been there before. She staggered to her feet, glancing around the grand hall. The portraits on the walls were different, the figures within them no longer looked sorrowful. Their wet faces softened, their eyes free of the anguish that had once haunted them. Emma felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a sense of freedom that had been absent for as long as she could remember. The house no longer felt oppressive. The shadows no longer felt oppressive. The shadows no longer alive with unseen eyes. She had done it. She had freed them. As she made her way back to her room, a soft whisper drifted through the air, gentle and filled with gratitude. "Thank you." Emma smiled, her heart light for the first time since she had arrived. The house was silent now, truly silent, the spirits at peace, the curse lifted. But as she lay in bed that night, a new thought crept into her mind, a question that lingered in the darkness. Was the house truly at peace, or had she merely awakened something far older? Something that had been waiting for the bloodline to be freed. With that final thought, she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, unaware of the faint shadow that lingered in the corner, watching over her with ancient, unblinking eyes.